This webinar is being presented by PHP's advocacy program, which works to empower parents with the knowledge and skills to improve systems of care and participate in policymaking on behalf of children with disabilities. The advocacy program is supported in part by grants from First Five Santa Clara County and Silicon Valley Community Foundation. This webinar is part of San Jose State University's conference series called Transforming Communities, a Movement to Racial Justice. Here at Parents Helping Parents, our mission is to strengthen families who are raising loved ones with disabilities through education, support, and advocacy. We do this by providing information, training, and resources to empower families and improve systems of care. We were founded 50 years ago by a multiracial group, Silicon Valley Parents. And currently, our team of about 60 volunteers and 40 staff support 6,000 families each year with free trainings and support groups, and thousands of phone calls to assist families in finding resources and navigating systems of care. For the past 2 years, PHP has convened the community together on the intersectionality of disability and race. We see disability and race as inseparable identities and experiences that shape how we interact with and encounter the world. We know that systems such as the healthcare, education, and justice systems are not always built to support people with disabilities and people of color. And as a result, these systemic inequities often lead to worse overall life outcomes for these groups, especially individuals at the intersection of disability and race. In order to build a truly inclusive, equitable, and just community, we must learn to see the whole person, the multiple identities that impact our lives, and make changes within systems to better support all members of our community. Here at PHP, we are dedicated to working toward addressing the intersection of disability and race, and to building a more equitable community for everyone. As part of this work, we are welcoming today a guest speaker, Conrad Crump, to expand our understanding of intersectionality and equity. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit questions for our speaker by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be reviewed and selected by our team to be answered following the speaker's presentation. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Conrad Crump is a seasoned leader, policy advocate, and performer who is deeply dedicated to effecting positive change for marginalized communities, bringing both professional expertise and lived experience to his work. Currently, Conrad is the senior policy advocate at Disability Rights California, where he leads legislative advocacy on disability rights and equity. He holds a BA from UC Berkeley and a Master of Public Administration from University of Southern California. Conrad is a member of the City of Sacramento Racial Equity Council and a national speaker on race, disability, equity, and justice. He is also a talented actor, writer, and vocalist. A big welcome to our speaker, Conrad Crump.
Conrad, can you please unmute yourself?
My apologies. Thank you again so much for that warm welcome, Beverly. I want to give a huge thank you to Parents Helping Parents and all of the folks that are behind the scenes on the production team, our ASL interpreters, our language interpreters, really doing the work to make sure we can all have an accessible conversation today. Again, good afternoon. My name is Conrad Crump. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Senior Policy Advocate with Disability Rights California. And to give you a visual description, I am a Black man with black and gold rimmed glasses, a salt and peppered beard, and my hair is intricately styled in dreadlocks and pulled back into a ponytail. I'm wearing a black suit, a white collared shirt, and a Star Wars themed tie with stormtroopers on it, because Star Wars will actually help us frame today's conversation. So at this point, what I'd actually like to do is go ahead and share my screen so we can get into our conversation today. Now, again, I want to start us by really just grounding ourselves and really getting to understand where we are and who we are. With that being said, I want to ground us in the force behind this work. Now, Disability Rights California has been in the game for more than 45 years, really on the front lines, in the trenches, fighting and advancing the rights and dignity for and equality for people with disabilities in California. And today I want to go ahead and have a conversation with you all that will include both data as well as lived experience. And I'd also like to share what happens when race, disability, and systemic oppression intersect in ways that can literally shorten lives. And to move us through our conversation today, I'd actually like to just ground us and talk to you all about how today will be structured. So you can think of this as our first Rebel Alliance briefing. So first, I'll ground us in some key concepts around race and disability, because language and framing certainly matter. Then I'll show a little bit of my own lived experience, not as the story, but as a story that can help describe the systems that we're talking about. From there, we'll take a look at Anakin's journey as a way to look at how system influences shape outcomes. Then we'll also look at what the data tells us, especially where race and disability intersect in ways that can produce real harm. And finally, we'll close with what it means to join the Rebel Alliance. And this is where I'll share what noticing, interrupting, and building can look like in real life. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to share 3 key concepts that can help us see how race and disability function within systems, and not just as individual experiences. Now, for the first concept, I want to ground us in intersectionality. Now, some of you are probably thinking, Conrad, what does race have to do with disability? Everything. No, literally everything. Race and racism have everything to do with disability, which is why the first principle of disability justice is intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a term created by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, where she specifically addresses how Black women exist at the intersections of race and sexism. Intersectionality acknowledges that we all have different experiences based on race, class, disability, sexuality, age, and much more. Now, keep in mind that recognizing these intersections also means understanding that racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, anti-trans, and queer violence all interact together. And in the words of the late great ancestor, Audre Lorde, she said, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives." Now, for those of us who are listening and may not be able to see the slide, I want to give a quick description. So the image on your screen shows a graphic labeled intersectionality and disability. And at the center, there's a simple human figure, and surrounding the figure is a semicircle divided into a number of different segments representing different identities. These segments are labeled as nationality, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, gender identity, and class. It's also important to note that at the bottom of the graph, there is a comparison showing about 26% of people who are identified as having a disability and about 74% of people who are non-disabled. Moving on to our next slide. Ableism. So if intersectionality helps us see how multiple identities interact within systems, the next concept asks us a more specific question. Who gets to be defined as normal or capable inside of those systems and who doesn't? Now, this question brings us to ableism. And ableism isn't just about individual prejudice. It's about the standards that our schools and workplaces, our healthcare systems and policies are used to decide who's valued, who gets seen as normal, who gets seen as capable, and so on. Ableism essentially is discrimination against people with disabilities based on the belief that they are less valuable or capable than non-disabled people. And when ableism interacts with race, class, gender, or immigration status, the impact is often amplified. Now, in the center of this slide, there's a graphic titled, "What is Ableism?" And one section, it's actually divided into 4 sections. One section shows 2 people arguing, and that is labeled as negative attitudes. Another shows symbols that looks like an exclamation mark and a lightning bolt, and that's labeled as offensive language. And then there's a third section that shows a group of figures standing with what appears to be a wheelchair user set apart, and that third section is labeled excluding disabled people. The final section shows a person's looking concerned while holding a phone and is labeled stereotypes and misconceptions. Now, together, the image illustrates that ableism can show up in attitudes, language, exclusion, and false assumptions, not just in physical barriers. This intersects because people of color experience ableism and racism simultaneously. Now, I want to move on to our next slide. Our next concept that we're going to talk about is white supremacy. And I want to be very clear about what I mean here. Now, I'm not just talking about individual hate groups or extremist organizations. I'm talking about the system that we are all part and parcel of. White supremacy is the system that centers whiteness as the default for how bodies, minds, behaviors, productivity, professionalism, and even beauty is defined. Now, that system shapes our schools, it shapes our healthcare system, it shapes our workplaces, and it shapes our disability policies. White supremacy gets to decide who is seen as credible, who is seen as capable, who gets the patience, and who gets punishment. And when disability exists inside a system that's built around white, non-disabled norms, disabled people of color actually experience the harms and they're compounded. And this is not by accident, it's actually by design. Now, for those of you who might not be able to see the slide, the title reads White Supremacy with a subtitle that says the system that centers whiteness as the norm. And in it, there are 2 images. The first is a circular graphic labeled white supremacy culture. In the center of the circle are the words white supremacy culture, and surrounding it are segments, and those segments list common characteristics of that culture. These segments include either or thinking, perfectionism, sense of urgency, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, I'm the only one, individualism, quantity over quality, defensiveness, and the only right way. The next image shows how white supremacy shows up at work. And it lists pretty much most of the previously listed characteristics, but there are a few additions, which include worship of the written word, as well as paternalism. Now, I also want to note that at the bottom of that image, the name Tima Okun is presented, as well as their website. And the name of that website is dismantlingracism.org. If you would love to check it out, I certainly encourage you to do so. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take us to our next slide. Now, I want everyone here to, if you are able, to look at this slide and imagine the universe of a child, wide open, full of possibilities. Now, every single star that you see here in this galaxy is a path that they can take. Not every star burns equally bright, though, and it doesn't burn equally bright for every child. there's structural racism, lack of access, and disability stigma, can all be something that can, mean that stars are dimmer or further away. Now, as a personal anecdote, as a kid in Sacramento, I was told I would never graduate high school. My stars looked pretty dim at the time. But the truth is, systems, not individuals, are what often dim the light. The systems around them, like their schools, healthcare, discipline, and belief, can actually help these stars burn brighter, or they can pull them off their course. Now, I'd like to talk about what that looks like for me. And not because my story is the story, but it's a way that I can demonstrate that the way these systems show up in a real person's life. And this is me. As a young kid, I was very inquisitive. I always loved to dress nice, as you can see depicted on the slide. And I always tried to do what was right and what was expected of me. However, my story had a different turn. And I won't give you the whole story from when I was a child, but I'll fast forward to 2017. In 2017, I survived a brain injury after having had a stroke. At first, I didn't understand what had happened to me. I just knew that my memory felt fuzzy. Everything felt a little different. My concentration was off, and my confidence took a hit as well. So just to give you a little bit of a background, on June 9th, 2017, I was walking down K Street in downtown Sacramento on a warm summer day when I started to see white spots in my vision. I felt extremely lethargic, dizzy, and thought maybe I just needed to sit down. I ended up sitting, or attempting to sit, on a cement block outside of a building downtown, and I suddenly blacked out. When I came to, there were a multitude of people standing around me. I saw that my wallet was on my chest, and I was so confused. And then I realized I was actually on a stretcher being lifted into an ambulance. While I was there, still disoriented, I actually tried to jump up and run. I didn't understand what was happening in that moment. The EMT there actually told me to calm down, and then I passed out again, and I started seizing. I was told later that I had been seizing for several minutes as I was being taken to the ICU. And after I was released from the hospital, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. As I was released from the hospital and I went home to my parents, I didn't realize everything that I had lost. I struggled, y'all. I struggled to do basic things like brush my teeth. I struggled to tie my shoes. I struggled to do things that my body would do on autopilot, no problem whatsoever. And, not long after I returned to work, I struggled with my memory. I struggled with my focus, and I struggled just being able to stay engaged in conversations. My daily life felt harder, but nothing about my body actually looked any different. And this is the thing about disability. When someone has a visible injury like a cast or a wheelchair, or we see someone in a sling, we immediately understand what's happening and we make accommodations. We know that there's accommodations that are needed. We don't ask someone with a broken leg to climb a flight of stairs. We don't ask someone with their arm in a sling to carry heavy objects. But when there's an injury or a disability that isn't visible, people forget. And when people forget, struggles stop being seen as disabilities and they start being treated as personal failures. And that's where disability stops being just a medical thing and it starts becoming a political thing. Now, because when disability is invisible, that burden shifts the responsibility. The responsibility is no longer on the system to accommodate. It's actually placed on the individual to perform as if nothing ever happened. And for many Black and brown people and people of color, that burden is heavier. there's actually often less grace for forgetting. There's less patience for slowing down. There's less benefit of the doubt. Now, behaviors that might be understood as a disability and others might more often be interpreted as incompetence or disengagement or a lack of effort when they show up in Black and brown bodies. Now, back to me, years later, I learned something else that actually helped everything click, excuse me. I was diagnosed with ADHD. Now, suddenly, terms like executive dysfunction and time blindness and impulsivity and disorganization and poor focus, all of these terms gave language to patterns that I had lived with since this young boy you see in the screen. I had always known these things about myself, but without a framework or without any type of way to explain it, I internalized all of this as just a character flaw. For years, I carried a deep sense of shame and depression because I believed that the problem was me. As a young adult, after graduating high school, I was able to obtain different employment, and I was actually let go from one job because of timeliness. As an older adult, I was actually placed on a performance improvement plan, and I was let go because of performance issues. And what I now understand is that in those moments, they weren't isolated incidents. They were actually moments where my disability showed up, but the system interpreted it as a failure. Now, my stroke made my disability visible to me. The ADHD diagnosis actually helped me understand that this is something that has been there for a long time. And in both cases, the real harm wasn't just the condition, it was actually how the system responded. Once productivity and speed and consistency became the standard, then it was something that I had to realize that there was something greater at work beneath the surface. And this is exactly what intersectionality looks like in real life. Race shaping how disability is interpreted, and disability shaping how failure gets assigned and to whom. And this is exactly why systems, not individuals, must change. Now, I want to move on because when I look back at my story, what stands out isn't just what I did or what I didn't do. It's how the system around me interpreted my behavior and my needs and my risk. And that's a pattern that we see over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. We see it in the stories we tell. And I realize that my story isn't unique. It's actually a pattern that has been a story that has been told for generations. And it follows a familiar arc. Potential identified early, needs misunderstood, behavior reinterpreted as a threat. And I'd actually like to move forward and talk about this in our next slide, where we introduce Anakin Skywalker. Now, when we talk about race, disability, and equity, we talk about stories of, transformation or stories of resilience, stories about, how systems can either uplift or destroy. And I thought, what better story to explore than one of the most famous character arcs in film history, Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. Now, we're going to use his life as a metaphor because just like Anakin, so many of us are shaped by forces outside of our control: systemic oppression, family circumstances, racism, ableism. Anakin is introduced in the story as being exceptionally gifted, but instead of support, what he mostly encounters is fear of his emotions, fear of his attachment, and fear of what he might become. Now, over time, that fear shapes how he is treated and eventually how he sees himself. So now what I want to do is take a shift and look at Anakin's story. Now, in this slide, we have the X-Wing versus the TIE fighter along a graph setup. Now, this is a depiction of not a series of choices for Anakin, but more so as a trajectory of his life over time. Now, at the bottom of the graph, we have on the left side conception, and then at the far right, we have demise. On the left side of the graph in green, we have protective factors. And then we also have, and the protective factors are demonstrated with an arrow pointing upward. And then we also have risk factors with an arrow pointing downward. Now, this chart is going to guide our journey. And so I want you to notice the ships. Now, this isn't just Star Wars fun. It's actually a reminder that people's lives are often pulled in between these two different forces. One force trying to pull them towards destruction and another force trying to pull them toward resilience. Now, we're going to move on to the next slide. We have pregnancy and birth. Now, I want you to look at this and read this visually, not morally. The green the green lightsabers actually represent protection, and the red represent risk. And what matters isn't any single lightsaber. It's actually the balance over time. At birth, we see Anakin's born into slavery, no father present, which is a major early risk factor, by the way. We see his life, of course, starting with heavy risk. No father in the picture, born into slavery. These circumstances are stacked against him before he could even speak. And that's not just science fiction. It's actually a reality for many kids of color, particularly kids with disabilities and children who are also born into poverty. I think about myself. My mother raised me, after my father left. So I know what it means to grow up in an environment where systemic challenges are already waiting for you at your birth. Now, as we progress through the slides, we see childhood. Now, as a child, Anakin was brilliant, but he was taken from his mom at age 10. That separation shaped his fears of abandonment for the rest of his life. Now, we see a lot of parallels here. Children separated from their parents by incarceration. Children separated from their parents by immigration policies. Children separated from their parents by the foster system. All of this results in trauma. And that trauma isn't erased. It actually follows these children throughout the course of their lives. Now, I'd like to ask just a rhetorical question. What happens to a child's sense of safety when love and stability are replaced by systemic disruption? And just something to think about. As we go to our next slide of adolescence, this is where protective factors show up. We see a mentor in Obi-Wan Kenobi, access to education in the Jedi Order, being freed from slavery. These moments all remind us that the right interventions at the right times can actually change the trajectory of lives. I think about our schools. I think about our community programs. I think about our mentors. I'm a mentor myself, and I do a lot of youth engagement on substance use prevention. And I think about how when I show up and others like me show up, how that can literally rewrite the script of another young person's life. I can recall back at Sacramento City College and also at UC Berkeley, where I had teachers and professors who actually saw something in me when I didn't see it in myself. Other people certainly didn't, but I noticed that mentorship carried me beyond what I thought was possible. So we see this in Anakin's story with Obi-Wan Kenobi and him gaining that mentorship, structure, the education, and that sense of belonging. But I want to add a note that just because we do have a sense of protection, it doesn't necessarily erase the risks that can help change the trajectory of our lives. It just helps to change the trajectory of our lives, but it doesn't erase the risks. So I'll move on to our next slide. Now we see here adolescence, but risk factors, exposure to violence, family separation, and so forth. At the same time, we see Anakin being exposed to constant war. Violence, instability, family separation continues here. And this is all too real for many Black and brown youth. who are disproportionately exposed to violence, who are disproportionately exposed to instability and systems that separate them from their families, whether that's through, again, foster care system or disability services or incarceration. Now, I want to move on to our next slide. Now, we see in adulthood, Anakin's risk factors catching up to him: lack of trust, manipulation by corrupt systems, Palpatine. We've got domestic violence, devastating injuries, and ultimately becoming Darth Vader. Now, this isn't just a movie. It actually mirrors what happens when trauma and racism and ableism and lack of supports stack on top of each other. People aren't born villains, The fact that, Darth Vader is looked at as a villain, we have to remember that he was shaped by the conditions around him. So when society fails to show up, the Force doesn't go to the dark side. We actually push people there. So we see that by adulthood, the protective factors for Anakin are thin and his trust is eroding. A lot of manipulative influences increase, and physical injury and isolation is accelerated. And a lot of these risk factors, they've stacked really quickly. And I'll move on to our next slide. So let's just take a brief recap. Looking at Anakin's age across episodes, we look at the timeline. By age 45, Anakin's story ends. His life expectancy is cut short, shaped by systemic failures. Now, when we think about that in terms of data in real life, it's important to note that Black disabled men in America face lower life expectancies. They face health inequities, greater levels of poverty, as well as a lack of access, which shortens their lives every single day. Now, Star Wars, okay, it's fiction, right? But the reality of stealing years from our people, that's inequity. And that's something that we definitely need to take note and be mindful. Now, I want to talk to you about system influences. And this is where a lot of these influences come into play. We've got labor, childcare, education, social systems, healthcare, environmental, politics, right? All of these different things are systems that Anakin sustained and had to deal with, but it's also systems that we ourselves have to deal with. So looking back, the real villain wasn't Darth Vader. The real villain was the system that failed Anakin. And it's the same villain that we're fighting today. So now that we've seen how Anakin's life course unfolded, let's go ahead and zoom out a little further, because no person, no family exists in isolation. We live in systems that shape us: education, labor, politics that I mentioned, healthcare. All of these systems can either strengthen these protective factors or intensify the risk. Now let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. Now, this slide here labels system influences, where I'd like to invite you to think of this as the galactic map of sorts. Not a map of planets, but a map of systems that impact everyday lives. Now, disability and race, they're not a part of these systems. They actually are experienced within these systems, from our classrooms to our hospital settings to our workplaces, and of course, the political arena. And, I think back when I worked in the legislature for over a decade, I personally saw firsthand how legislation on paper actually translated directly into either barriers or opportunities and supports for families just like mine. And I'll go on to our next slide. Now here we have the Death Star. For those who may not be a Star Wars junkie, it's okay, I got you. Here we look at political systems as the Death Star. They can act like a Death Star. They're very massive, they're powerful, and they're often destructive to marginalized communities. So think about ways that we know that this shows up. For example, when I think about voter ID laws, when I think about redlining and housing policy, when I think about disability benefits, who gets to be excluded, who's included, and who gets left vulnerable? What happens when the very system that is meant to protect us is weaponized against us? Now, here we also have other systems at work, childcare, labor, all of these systems. And these are not just politics. It's also, the systems that we see here. And I want to actually bring out stormtroopers. So the stormtrooper, who is like an officer of sorts, is a perfect metaphor because they're not just, well, I'll say this, they're foot soldiers of the system. They enforce policies without really questioning who gets harmed. And that can look like things that we're all very familiar with, like a teacher without resources to support a disabled student, or an employer who is refusing to provide accommodations for a person with a disability. Now, the truth is, many people are stuck following orders from a broken system instead of actually transforming them. And I'll go on to our next slide. Now, here we have an expanded system. We have a Death Star, we have a Star Destroyer, and the Stormtrooper. Now, the galaxy politics come into play. International wars that we've seen with Anakin, and the story of Star Wars. But in reality, there's wars going on, very real wars in our neighborhoods, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, and within the systems that we live and must navigate. Now, this actually ripples into the lives of many people who live with disabilities. I think about this, and I think about, for example, how funding goes to, militarized equipment, how funding goes to certain agencies that shall remain nameless, but nevertheless, how that spending outpaces investments in healthcare, investments in education. I think about how immigrant families experience these policy gaps that separate, their children from the supports and from the families that they know and very well need. So I want to ask a rhetorical question to everyone here. Are we building Death Stars, or are we showing up in our community to try to build communities of care? Moving on, I want to show that, our galaxy here shows a number of different examples, but particularly the educational piece is key. Now, this is the X-wing. All of the other systems that I showed you, are different system forces. But the X-wing is actually one of our strongest rebel X-wings. Now, this looks like when schools provide inclusive learning or culturally responsive teaching. This looks like proper support for disabled students. And when this happens, whole trajectories and lives are able to shift. But if schools exclude or suspend or misdiagnose kids of color and kids with disabilities, they actually feed the pipeline toward inequity. I've seen youth in my experience who just needed one supportive teacher, one supportive person, but instead they were written off. Now, imagine, looking back at the story of Star Wars, imagine if Obi-Wan Kenobi never believed in Anakin and never believed in his potential at all. Where would he be? I'll move on to our next slide. So this slide essentially reminds us that health, mental health, the environment, all of these systems interact and intersect with disability and race. So when healthcare is inaccessible, when the environment is full of toxins at higher rates in Black and Brown communities and in Black and Brown neighborhoods, risk factors multiply. And so I also think about the story of Anakin, aka Darth Vader, and I realized Darth Vader's mask wasn't just about him being a villain. It was actually about disability. His health needs were turned into a weaponized image of fear instead of care. Now, moving on, I want to go back to the stormtroopers. And I want to pause here for a moment because, all of the systems that I talked about, I want to say that none of these systems act alone. Outcomes are shaped by how these systems stack up and how they overlap and how they reinforce one another. And also, none of us are outside of these systems. We are all part and parcel to them, whether we're educators, whether we're parents, whether we're providers, whether we're policymakers, whether we're advocates, whatever the case may be, whoever we all are a part of a system. And in this slide, we're able to see there's uniformity. We see replication. And we also see that even if there was an individual who wanted to have, some type of, different perspective, how that could get absorbed by the overall structure. Now, the question isn't whether we're a part of the system or not. The question is, what role will we play while we're there? Now, there's three systems that consistently shape outcomes for people of color with disabilities. There are many systems, but I want to highlight three: the political system, the education system, and healthcare. When it comes to the political system, these are the very systems that decide who gets protected and who gets policed. Their best, they fund access and inclusion and civil rights, but at their worst, they prioritize control, punishment, restraint, and austerity. And for students with disabilities, that difference is life-shaping. Now, when it comes to education, on the other hand, can be a powerful protective factor, as we mentioned before, but it can also be a site of surveillance, of discipline, and exclusion. The difference isn't the child. The difference is how the system is designed and resourced. Now, finally, when we talk about healthcare has the power to identify needs early. It has the power to support families. However, it can also misdiagnose, it can delay care, and it can also dismiss lived experience. Especially for children of color with disabilities, that gap really shows up fast. So I'll go ahead and move on to our next slide. So now everything that I just described isn't theoretical. When these systems align to support people, outcomes improve. And when they don't, the data tells us a very different story. In the empire, control is justified as order, but the cost of that order is human. And we don't have to imagine what that cost looks like. Now, when we look at the data, students of color are often overrepresented in special education and tend to experience more segregation and more disciplinary actions. And they also experience worse academic outcomes than their white peers. As it relates to discipline specifically, Black students with disabilities are disciplined at disproportionate rates. Students of color with disabilities generally experience the highest rates of suspension and expulsion than any other group. And Black students with disabilities are suspended at rates that are multiple times higher than their white non-disabled counterparts. And this is where race and disability collide most visibly. Behavior is linked to disability, and then that behavior is punished rather than supported, especially in Black and Brown students. These same behaviors are interpreted differently depending upon who's exhibiting them. Another area within education is the misidentification of disability, which can have significantly lifelong impacts. Black students are particularly vulnerable to being misidentified for a special education need. They're also being listed as being twice as likely as their white peers to get labeled with an intellectual or emotional disorder in childhood. Now, let's say you've been identified. We have a young Black student who's been identified as having a disability, at a very young age. Let's say a child, age 3. That child won't get retested possibly again until they're in kindergarten. Then if they, for whatever reason, don't pass that quote unquote test, that student might not get reevaluated again for another 3 years. And by that time, the disability may or may not be a part of that student's identity. And if not, they may act as if they have a disorder, even if that may not be the case. And moving on to our next slide. Oh, before I move on to our next slide, this slide here is an image of a school setting with an empty hallway with lockers lining both sides of the hallway. And the slide title says, Black students with disabilities are disciplined at disproportionate rates. Now, moving on to our next slide, healthcare systems. Now, this slide, just to give a description, has a title of healthcare systems often delay, dismiss, or misinterpret disability, especially for people of color. Now, this is an image of a hospital setting with an empty hallway there. Now, as it relates to health, people of color with disabilities face more discrimination and stigma than their white or non-disabled counterparts. Systemic factors of racism and ableism contribute to greater disparities in access to healthcare, which leads to delays in access or simply going without care for many people of color with disabilities. Additionally, it's important to note that people of color with disabilities often delay care more often than their white counterparts because of costs that are associated with that care. So we often see that according to statistics for all non-Hispanic, Black, and Hispanic adults, nearly 1 in 3 of people with disabilities skipped services due to the high cost. And this leads to another conversation about economic justice and economic barriers that are faced by a multitude of disabled communities of color. Moving on to our next slide, policy. This slide is an image of the California legislative floor with empty desks. It's what they call the chambers. And the title of the slide says, Policy choices determine which children receive support and which children are left out. Now, when we talk about policy choices, I work in policy. I'm a policy advocate, and I can't help but notice where different students receive support and where different students are left out. Particularly with what we're seeing, a great example of this is what we're seeing in the federal government. The dismantling of the entire Department of Education, the stripping of funds to students with special needs and to special needs programs. There was even, the rolling back of DEIA programs and how that impacts teachers. Just a number of different ways that funding now has to be, on an application for different types of funding. There is now a new requirement where you can't use over 200 terms, some of which include the word Black, some of which include the word disabled, some of which include the word indigenous, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go down the whole list of terms, but you get my point. This is something that is significantly impacting students and young people, as well as people of color with disabilities. This is going back to that Death Star, how they can be a massive force that can literally change entire communities and outcomes for those communities. Now, moving on to our next slide, here's where we land. Now, the stories that you heard today, they help teach us that inequity is never just about an individual. I mean, it can be, but it's often about a greater system at play. And what we do has to be something different. Now, we can choose. Do we want to replicate the empire system of exclusion, or do we want to build rebel alliances that actually honor equity, that honor justice, that honor access, that honor just inclusion and seeing the whole person? And, at the end of the day, like I said, Star Wars is fiction, but equity, that's a rebellion that we must win in real life. So at this point, I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the force. I'd like to invite you to join the Rebel Alliance. Now, joining the Rebel Alliance is simple. Now, basically, it's about choosing to interrupt systems that harm people of color with disabilities. Now, even though you're a part of these systems, It doesn't mean that you have to leave your role and and just quit your job. But what I'm asking you to do is use your role differently. And with that being said, I'd like to offer a simple pledge. Now, this isn't something that you would sign or something that you would post on your social media. This is actually something that you can practice, and I hope that you remember it. And as a performer and as an actor, I know that repetition is something that actually helps you remember things. So before we actually put this into practice, I'd actually like us all, from wherever you are, to repeat it. Now, I'll say it, and then you can repeat it. I pledge to notice systems of control instead of care. I pledge to interrupt harm when I see it, even if it's uncomfortable. I pledge to build conditions and relationships where disabled children and families of color will not only thrive, but, not only survive, but thrive. So I'll repeat that. I pledge to build conditions and relationships where disabled children and families of color will not only survive, but thrive. Now, what I'm asking you to do is notice. Notice where systems default to control instead of care, especially for disabled children of color. I'm asking you to interrupt and be intentional about this. Interrupt harmful patterns when you see them. There's a saying that says, if you see something, say something. Interrupt these patterns. These are the patterns that can be found in meetings, they can be found in classrooms, they can be found in policies and our everyday practices. And lastly, I'm asking you to build those relationships and build protections where they currently don't exist and strengthen the ones that do. In this moment, I want to take the moment to just thank everyone for joining today, but I especially want to give us first a personal shout out to the Rebel Alliance that I'm a part of here at Disability Rights California. And I would be remiss. I'm not going to name everyone. So interpreters, you don't have to interpret all of these names, but I'm just going to name a few because these are some champions that stick out in my mind who are really doing the work. I want to first and foremost give a shout out to Andy Imperato, Eric Harris. I want to give a shout out to Desiree Delonia. I want to give a shout out to Beck Levin. I want to give a shout out to the entire Umoja ERG. I want to give a shout out to the entire Estrella ERG. I want to give a shout out to Vanessa Ramos. I want to give a shout out to Vanessa Ochoa. I want to give a shout out to Elizabeth Campos. I want to give a shout out to all of my friends at the DHH staff, Raven. I want to give a shout out to Ken. I want to give a shout out to Anaí. I want to give a shout out to the folks who are really in the trenches on the ground, folks like Oscar and folks who are in these communities doing investigations, making sure people with disabilities have the protections that they need. Again, I'm not going to list everyone. I know there's a lot of names that I probably missed, and someone who's probably like, oh my goodness, Eric Harris comes to mind, Monica Porter Gilbert comes to mind, all of these champions who are a part of this Rebel Alliance that are doing the work. So with that, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to everyone that was able to participate in today's webinar. And I want to actually welcome each and every one of you. If there might be questions, I'm happy to do so at this time, but I'll pass it over to Marie and we'll take it to our next topic of discussion. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was absolutely incredible, Conrad. And I hope you feel the love, like so many hearts, so many applause coming to you. I'm Maria Dane. I'm Executive Director of Parents Helping Parents. My visual description is I am a Caucasian female, middle-aged with glasses and pulled back hair, wearing a navy jacket. And Conrad, such a pleasure to learn from you today. Such grace, such knowledge. Our hats are off to you. We have a few minutes for questions. Please put them in the chat. And we'll get through as many as we can. First, there's a few comments, Conrad. Powerful and excellent presentation. Thank you so much from Lori. We have what a brilliant analogy. That's from Claudia. And we have a member of the Rebel Alliance, Richard Gallo. He says, now is more important than ever to do advocacy, especially with cuts to Medicaid. The state of California is facing massive cuts that will cap or eliminate Medicaid optional services such as mental health, durable medical equipment, dental, eyeglasses. We cannot go back to caps, waiting lists, and inadequate caregiver needs. So thank you, Richard, for that. So let's do our best with these questions. First question is, this is a tricky one. Could someone be a white supremacist without knowing about it?
Well, that's a great question. I understand that we all live in a system of white supremacy. So understanding that the fact that, let me say that we in the United States, live under a system of white supremacy predominantly. And so it's embedded in all of us, no matter who you are. There are tenets of that we have to constantly take an introspective look at ourselves. We have to question our biases. We have to look at the ways in which we show up, the ways in which we interpret things. So, a person may have different types of tenets of white supremacy and characteristics that I talked about, in an earlier slide. But, I just know that in this culture that we are, that we've been socialized in, we all have to do our part to check ourselves and make sure that we're not othering people or excluding people.
All right, wonderful. An anonymous attendee asks, where have you observed effective practices to support Black and African American students? And what were some of them? What are the tangible strategies LEAs can use to improve services for Black students? And I'm thinking they mean Black students with disabilities.
Very great question. So a part of my advocacy outside of my work is in my community. I'm an activist at heart. And a part of my involvement in the community was an organization called the Black African American Advisory Board, which is an advisory board that was created to keep the Sacramento City Unified School District accountable to a number of different recommendations that the board actually, proposed to the school district. And with that being said, the district agreed to these recommendations, and we created a timeline and, had them basically held their feet to the fire. And we saw a lot of different things happening when it comes to like expulsions, graduation rates, absenteeism, a number of different ways. So I would say first and foremost, in your local community, there's got to be someone who's advocating or fighting. There's a number of different nonprofits I know within the state of California that is actively working, one of which is the Black Parallel School Board. They're doing tremendous work throughout the entire state to make sure that Black students aren't left behind. And there's others as well. So I just wanted to, kind of highlight, that's kind of like a high level example. And in that space, we're showing up at the school district meetings. We're showing up at the parent advisory committee. We're showing up at the school sites. We're doing a number of different actions. Instead of, talking about it, we're actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
Okay, we have a question from Beck Levin. He says, thank you so much, Conrad. What are your thoughts on the overdiagnosis of Black children with oppositional defiance disorder? How do we best fight this trend?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's my buddy, Beck. Thank you for asking. And they always come with the heat. I think what it's going to boil down to is the first and foremost, the relationships and the education. We've got to, first of all, know what it is. We've got to know who's impacted by it. And once we are able to have that moment of clarity and understanding, then we can organize. Again, different systems shape outcomes. So, whether it's a political system at the local level, from the local school board or your local city council or your county board of supervisors. A lot of people forget about the county board of supervisors, who often have a lot more funding than the city council. And then you also have the state, the state legislature, so I think being able to organize and have those unified voices come together, as well as having folks with lived experiences come and tell their testimonies, is one of the greatest ways that we can impact change.
Awesome. Conrad, Patricia Mars was wondering if you have any resources for employers who are looking at accommodation policies for adult employees with disabilities, the non-physical ones you are speaking of. Does Disability Rights California have that sort of resource, or is there another agency you'd suggest?
And shout out to my employer, DRC, because they certainly do provide accommodations where a lot of other employers might not. There's a resource, and it's probably something that folks may be familiar with. I believe it's JAN, JAN, Job Access Network, where you can have a number of different resources just a whole host from, lighting on the floor instead of the light that comes from the top down. A number of different resources that can certainly be used. So I would recommend starting there. And then you can certainly follow up with me. I'd be happy to share my contact information, and we can discuss more about what some of those actual tangible resources look like. But also online, I think a lot of it stems from a lot of the work that's being done with regard to some of the accommodations and really the educational piece around how people are showing up differently. There's a lot of ways to do things, and just because you do something different doesn't mean that you do it deficient. I have this actually written. I know you probably can't see it because I have a screen, virtual screen on, but I have a whiteboard in my office that says different does not mean deficient. And so just because a person does something differently doesn't mean that they're deficient at what they do.
Fantastic. We have a question from Gwendolyn Captain, who says, is there local counselors or therapists for young men of color struggling with mental health issues due to the trauma they have experienced?
Yeah, that's a great
question.
A big
one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is, well, I can speak locally here from what I say locally and throughout the state. There's a resource called Brother Be Well by a nonprofit, Mental Health California. And with Mental Health California's work, they do a number of different programs and practices for boys and men of color, specifically relating to their trauma and mental health, as well as substance use prevention. I really volunteer a lot of my time with this program, and I've met so many young folks, and I've seen their lives literally change. In that program, they have a number of different licensed clinicians and therapists on the call, as well as other youth mentors like myself, to be able to help young boys and men of color, change their trajectories and really be one of those protective factors in their lives.
Fantastic. And I'd like to do a plug for the parent centers throughout California who can often help find really local resources. We have, we'll be putting a link in the chat so you can find your local parent center. Question on, this is really subtle, in the educational system, it's from an anonymous attendee. It can be very difficult to raise issues of discrimination against disabled kids of color. For example, there was a situation at my son's school where the vice principal automatically assumed a disabled child of color was the cause of a conflict. How do we raise issues like this?
Wow. First and foremost, I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. I have some other choice words, but I'll keep it I'll keep it professional, because I really don't like that. But I would say, one way that I could recommend is first of all, trying to get involved in as many groups such as Parents Helping Parents, other organizations that have resources. I would also reach out to Disability Rights California. We have an intake line, and this is the work that we do. I mean, when I said that, we're literally in the trenches and we're boots on the ground on the front lines fighting this fight, I really mean that. There are a lot of folks who are doing a number of different things behind the scenes. And yeah, it's challenging. It's hard, especially with, different the Office of Civil Rights and things being dismantled. I know in the California legislature, a bill was passed just this last session to, make sure that there were these discrimination prevention coordinators put in place so that, students of all protected classes could have a place to go, and an Office of Civil Rights would then be created where complaints could go to, because right now it's really difficult to raise and elevate those concerns. But I would say start with your local protection and advocacy agency like us at Disability Rights, as well as other organizations that specifically like Parents Helping Parents and, Mental Health California, Black Parallel School Board, other organizations that are really doing the work to, make sure that students of color, particularly students of color with disabilities, are not being left behind.
Okay, we are coming to the end, and we still have 17 questions. So here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to save these questions. So Nicole and Megan, if you can make sure we save them, and we will get all of you an email within the next few days to answer questions that are unanswered. We'll include links that were shared in the chat earlier to make sure that you guys have copies of all of these. And I believe they are launching a poll. We'd love to hear about all that you have learned. And have some other information for you. We're proud to share that we had over 151 people participate in this webinar today. And we're a robust group of people with disabilities, of family members, of allies, and of professionals. Our professionals came from every walk of life. They're from schools, they're from the government, they are elected officials, they are in healthcare, they are in law, they are in legal advocacy. So we already have a rebel coalition here. So thank you, everybody. And there's a number of ways that you can get involved in making change and joining the Rebel Alliance in our society and in our systems of care. First, you can support special education by signing a petition that's wrapping up this Friday regarding the efforts to move special education oversight out of the U.S. Department of Education. So that is going out in the chat. And please share that with those who have a heart for disabilities. Secondly, Parents Helping Parents does a Parent for Change advocacy cohort run by Joanna Kent and Viviana Barnwell and Beverly. We do it about 5 a year. We have one coming up July to September. You can apply through June. Third, there are winter and spring legislative visits at the local and state level. You can watch our newsletter for details. There's also visits being organized by Disability Rights California, by the ARC, by Family Voices of California, by Disability Voices United. So please join us in visiting the Capitol and making sure we are loud in our voice. And finally, in the poll that we are launching, we have asked you to complete a pledge to share how you will take action in your own community to advance disability and racial justice. There's links in the chat in English and Spanish for that. And Conrad, I join you. I'm with you in the Rebel Pledge. I will notice, I will interrupt, and I will build. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today, and a special thank you to Conrad. That was phenomenal. And to Disability Rights California, who has been an extraordinary Rebel Alliance for decades and generations. And this is our third time doing a training on intersectionality, race, and disability, and it was phenomenal. We will be doing another one at the end of the year. We hope you will join us again, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day.